Behind the glitter of rhinestones and the sweet sound of steel guitars, country music's golden era was anything but peaceful. Rivalries, jealousy, and shocking betrayals simmered beneath the surface, shaping careers and breaking friendships. From backstage feuds at the Grand Ole Opry to bitter splits that rocked Nashville, these stories reveal the hidden dark side of country's most legendary stars. Today, we uncover petty feuds and backstabbing moments that forever changed country music history. Hank Williams Sr. versus Roy Acuff. When people think of the Grand Ole Opry in its golden age, two names often rise to the top: Hank Williams Sr. and Roy Acuff. Acuff had long been crowned the king of country music, a revered figure who helped bring the genre into the mainstream. But when the young Hank Williams stormed onto the Opry stage in the late 1940s, his raw voice, heartbreaking lyrics, and electrifying charisma threatened to eclipse Acuff's legacy. Nashville audiences, once loyal to Acuff, suddenly couldn't get enough of Hank's tortured soul ballads. Behind the scenes, whispers of rivalry quickly spread. Acuff, though publicly gracious, reportedly bristled at Hank's rising stardom. Some Opry insiders claimed that Acuff felt Williams was reckless, unreliable, and undeserving of the spotlight he commanded. Hank, on the other hand, resented the Opry's constant pressure to clean up his act, an expectation set in part by veterans like Acuff, who had maintained a polished traditional image. Their feud wasn't always open warfare, but it simmered in subtle digs and backstage tension. Acuff allegedly dismissed Hank's behavior as immature and self-destructive, while Hank is said to have viewed Acuff as outdated, clinging to a crown that no longer belonged to him. This quiet battle for the Opry throne was less about direct insults and more about the symbolic passing of the torch. One man desperate to hold on, the other too wild to truly inherit it. The most telling moment came when Acuff, after watching Hank's decline into alcoholism and missed performances, remarked that Williams had a $1 million voice and a 10-cent brain. That harsh statement reflected both Acuff's disappointment and perhaps a touch of bitterness. Hank, meanwhile, spiraled deeper, his short but explosive career ending tragically at just 29 years old. In hindsight, the Acuff-Williams tension captures the heart of Nashville's golden era, a struggle between tradition and rebellion, stability and chaos. Acuff represented the old guard, steady, polished, and respectable. Hank embodied the outlaw spirit before the outlaw movement even existed, raw, untamed, and self-destructive. Their feud wasn't about screaming matches or physical fights, but about legacy, envy, and the fragile pride of two men who defined country music in very different ways. It remains one of the most fascinating backstories of that era, a clash of two giants whose strained relationship mirrored the generational shift happening in country music itself. Patsy Cline versus Loretta Lynn. On the surface, Patsy Cline and Loretta Lynn were the very picture of friendship. Loretta often credited Patsy as her mentor, the woman who showed her how to navigate the cutthroat world of Nashville with class, confidence, and fire. Their bond was legendary. Loretta even rushed to Patsy's hospital bedside after her near-fatal car crash in 1961, and they often appeared inseparable in public. But behind the warmth and sisterhood lay whispers of a rivalry that Nashville insiders never stopped gossiping about. Patsy was already established as country's leading female voice, commanding respect with her powerhouse vocals and ability to cross over into pop markets. Loretta, meanwhile, was the hungry newcomer, an emerging talent from Kentucky whose raw Appalachian twang connected with working-class audiences. As Loretta's star began to rise in the early 1960s, some industry figures began framing her as the next Patsy Cline, a comparison that was flattering but also dangerous. In a business where egos were fragile and stardom fleeting, no one wanted to be replaced. Stories circulated about subtle competition between the two women. Patsy, known for her sharp tongue, sometimes teased Loretta about her country girl mannerisms and simple stage presence. Loretta, for her part, admitted years later that while she adored Patsy, she also felt the pressure of being compared to her constantly. That unspoken tension, mentor versus protege, legend versus rising star, was a reality neither could fully escape. The tragedy of Patsy's untimely death in a plane crash in 1963 froze their relationship in time. Publicly, Loretta always honored Patsy, even dedicating songs and stories to keep her friend's legacy alive. But privately, there were those who claimed Loretta's career soared partly because the one woman who could have overshadowed her was suddenly gone. It's an uncomfortable truth, one Loretta herself never embraced, but one Nashville historians can't ignore. What makes the Patsy-Loretta dynamic so fascinating is its duality, a genuine friendship laced with the unavoidable shadows of competition. In a male-dominated industry, two women at the top were bound to be measured against each other, even if they personally cherished their bond. The line between sisterhood and rivalry was thin, and the industry's constant comparisons only sharpened it. Looking back, Patsy Cline and Loretta Lynn's story isn't just about two women clashing. It's about how Nashville itself often pitted artists against each other, feeding rivalries to fuel publicity and audience intrigue. Their relationship was both tender and tense, a reminder that in country music's golden era, even the closest friendships carried the weight of ambition and envy. Johnny Cash versus Porter Wagoner. In the golden era of country music, few contrasts were as striking as Johnny Cash and Porter Wagoner. Cash, the rebellious man in black, embodied darkness, raw honesty, and the struggles of addiction and redemption. Wagoner, on the other hand, was the polished showman of Nashville, famous for his rhinestone suits, flashy television show, and carefully curated traditional image. Their paths often collided, and their differences fueled one of the era's most whispered-about tensions. On stage and on record, the two rarely went head-to-head, but behind the scenes in Nashville, their approaches to music and stardom clashed. Wagoner represented the Nashville establishment, safe, polished, and commercial, while Cash lived and sang on the edge, often battling his demons publicly. Cash's wild antics, including arrests, missed shows, and his fiery relationship with June Carter, were the antithesis of Wagoner's family-friendly persona. The contrast created an unspoken rivalry, two men pulling the genre in opposite directions. Insiders claimed that Wagoner often dismissed Cash's behavior as reckless and damaging to the industry's reputation. In interviews, Wagoner implied that performers like Cash gave country music a bad name with their lawless ways. Cash, in turn, seemed to relish the outsider role, famously turning his back on Nashville's expectations and embracing the darker outlaw persona. While he rarely addressed Wagoner directly, his disdain for the establishment and those who embodied it was clear. Their feud became more personal when Cash's star power began to eclipse Wagoner's television empire. By the late 1960s, Cash's televised prison concerts at Folsom and San Quentin captivated the nation, while Wagoner's variety show, though still popular, started to feel old-fashioned. Nashville insiders noted the irony. While Wagoner worked tirelessly to polish the image of country music, Cash's raw authenticity and rebellion captured the wider American imagination. That shift in influence stung, and it widened the rift between them. The final straw, according to some accounts, was Wagoner's sharp criticism of the outlaw movement Cash helped inspire. Wagoner believed the outlaw label glamorized rebellion and substance abuse, undermining the respectability that artists like him had fought for. Cash, of course, didn't care. He embraced the chaos, proudly standing as country music's dark anti-hero. Though their rivalry was rarely a screaming match in public, it symbolized a deeper cultural battle within country music itself, the fight between tradition and rebellion, polish and grit, control and chaos. In the end, both men left indelible marks on the genre, but their uneasy relationship remains a reminder of how divided Nashville once was. Tammy Wynette versus George Jones. Few relationships in country music were as celebrated and as destructive as the union of Tammy Wynette and George Jones. Dubbed the first couple of country music, they were adored by fans for their heartfelt duets and their larger-than-life romance. But behind the stage lights, their marriage was a storm of passion, betrayal, and bitter feuding that spilled far beyond the music. When they first married in 1969, the pairing seemed perfect. Wynette, already hailed as the first lady of country music, brought elegance and vulnerability to every note she sang. Jones, with his rich, emotive voice, was revered as one of the greatest vocalists the genre had ever known. Together, they became the embodiment of country love songs. Yet almost immediately, cracks began to show. Jones's long battle with alcoholism and erratic behavior, earning him the nickname No-Show Jones for his frequent absences, clashed with Wynette's desire for stability and success. Arguments turned into public scandals. Jones's drinking led to violent outbursts and unpredictable behavior. While Wynette, fiercely ambitious, refused to let her career collapse under the weight of his demons. Nashville tabloids feasted on their troubles, turning their personal pain into headline fodder. Behind the scenes, friends recalled heated confrontations that bordered on explosive, with both parties hurling accusations of betrayal and infidelity. The music they created together only intensified the irony. Songs like Golden Ring and We're Gonna Hold On became timeless hits, celebrated for their themes of love, endurance, and heartbreak. Fans swooned, unaware or perhaps willfully ignoring that the couple's real life was unraveling in the opposite direction. By 1975, their marriage ended in a bitter divorce, but the feud didn't stop there. Even after separating, Wynette and Jones continued to spar in the press. Tammy often criticized George's inability to stay sober, while George accused Tammy of exaggerating their problems for publicity. Their feud became legendary, embodying the darker reality behind Nashville's glossy image. And yet, the industry and the fans kept pushing them back together. Years after their split, they were still persuaded to perform as a duo, their onstage chemistry undeniable, even when their personal relationship was fraught with resentment. Looking back, the Wynette-Jones saga is one of country music's greatest paradoxes. Their feud, as ugly as it often was, produced some of the genre's most beautiful and enduring songs. It was a love story turned battlefield, a tragic tale of two icons whose passions for music and for each other collided in ways that were both breathtaking and destructive. Buck Owens versus Merle Haggard. In the heart of California's Central Valley, Bakersfield became the unlikely epicenter of a country music revolution. Two names defined its rough-edged, electrified sound: Buck Owens and Merle Haggard. Together, they put Bakersfield on the map, standing in sharp contrast to Nashville's polished country-politan style. But behind the shared pride in their city, Owens and Haggard carried on a rivalry that was as much about ego as it was about music. Buck Owens was already a star by the early 1960s, with his Telecaster-driven honky-tonk anthems dominating the charts. His band, the Buckaroos, became synonymous with Bakersfield grit, and his showmanship made him a household name. Then came Merle Haggard, rougher, darker, and fiercely authentic. With songs like Mama Tried and Okie from Muskogee, Haggard embodied the working man's struggle and rebellion, qualities that quickly won him a devoted following. Though Owens and Haggard respected each other's talents, their competition for dominance was impossible to ignore. Owens was said to have resented how quickly Haggard's fame rose, threatening to steal the Bakersfield crown he had worked so hard to claim. Insiders whispered that Owens, always the businessman, saw Haggard not just as a peer, but as a direct rival cutting into his market. The tension deepened when Haggard openly challenged Owens' approach to music. Owens embraced showbiz, complete with bright suits and a knack for keeping control of his brand. Haggard, by contrast, dismissed that glitz, insisting that country music should speak from the heart, not the wallet. Their differences in philosophy led to a coolness between them, one that fans could sense even if it rarely boiled over publicly. Adding fuel to the rivalry was personal history. Before finding fame, Haggard had briefly played in Owens' band. While Owens valued control and loyalty, Haggard had bigger ambitions of his own. Their eventual split created an undercurrent of resentment, with some claiming Owens never fully forgave Haggard for stepping out of his shadow. Despite the rivalry, the two men shared an undeniable bond with Bakersfield. Their feud wasn't about hatred so much as it was about pride, two giants vying for the same throne in a small but fiercely important corner of the country world. In interviews later in life, both acknowledged the other's greatness, but the edge between them never fully disappeared. The Owens-Haggard clash represents a unique kind of backstabbing, not the shouting matches of Nashville's gossip columns, but the quieter bitterness of two titans fighting for the same legacy. Their competition pushed both to greater heights, and together they ensured that Bakersfield would forever hold a place in country music history. Dolly Parton versus Porter Wagoner. Few country music feuds were as emotional and as public as the split between Dolly Parton and Porter Wagoner. What began as a partnership that launched Dolly into stardom ended in bitterness, lawsuits, and one of the most iconic farewell songs in history. In the late 1960s, Porter Wagoner was already a household name. His rhinestone suits and syndicated TV show made him a staple of Nashville's family-friendly image. When he brought a young Dolly Parton onto his show in 1967, she was still an emerging talent, struggling to find her footing. Wagoner promised her national exposure, and together they became one of country's most beloved duos, recording hits like The Last Thing on My Mind. For a time, they were inseparable on stage, their chemistry captivating millions of viewers. But as Dolly's confidence grew, so did her ambition. She wanted to pursue a solo career, expand her songwriting, and step out of Wagoner's shadow. Porter, however, wasn't ready to let her go. He had invested in her career, and by many accounts, he felt entitled to her loyalty, and perhaps more. Their relationship, though professional, was often described as stormy, filled with clashes over creative direction and control. By 1974, the tension reached a breaking point. Dolly decided to leave Wagoner's show to strike out on her own, a move he took as a betrayal. Feeling wounded and abandoned, Porter lashed out in interviews, accusing Dolly of being ungrateful and self-centered. Their once powerful partnership devolved into a bitter feud that spilled across Nashville. It was during this painful transition that Dolly wrote, "I Will Always Love You." Far from a romantic ballad, the song was her heartfelt farewell to Wagoner, a message of gratitude mixed with a firm declaration of independence. Though Porter initially resisted, the song became a hit and cemented Dolly's status as a solo superstar. The irony, of course, was that the song born out of their feud would later become one of the most famous in music history. The bitterness didn't end there. Wagoner eventually sued Dolly for breach of contract, demanding a share of her future earnings. The lawsuit was settled out of court, but the scars remained. For years, their relationship was a cautionary tale of how mentorship could sour into resentment. Later in life, however, there was reconciliation. As Porter's health declined, Dolly publicly expressed her gratitude and respect for him, even visiting him near the end of his life. Their feud remains legendary, not just because of its bitterness, but because it birthed a timeless song and showed the painful cost of ambition in Nashville's golden era. Willie Nelson, the Nashville Establishment. If there was ever an artist who embodied rebellion against Nashville's polished system, it was Willie Nelson. Today, he's celebrated as an outlaw hero, but during the 1960s and early 1970s, Nelson was locked in an unspoken feud with the Nashville establishment itself. A collective battle against producers, executives, and the very formula that defined country's golden era. Willie first came to Music City as a songwriter, penning classics like Crazy for Patsy Cline and Hello Walls for Faron Young. His writing was undeniable, but when he tried to step forward as a performer, Nashville producers pushed him into a mold that never fit. They dressed him in suits, gave him arrangements drenched in violins and backing choruses, and forced him into the slick Nashville sound that Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley had perfected. The result was music that didn't feel like Willie, and audiences knew it. His records failed to capture the raw soul of his songwriting, leaving him perpetually overlooked as an artist. Behind the scenes, Nelson grew increasingly frustrated. He felt stifled, dismissed, and even ridiculed for his unconventional voice and style. Executives saw him as second tier, someone better suited to writing hits for others than performing them himself. For Willie, it was a kind of artistic backstabbing. The very industry he wanted to belong to kept him boxed in, undermining his potential. By the early 1970s, Nelson had had enough. He left Nashville entirely, retreating to Texas, where he reinvented himself among a new breed of country performers. Gone were the suits and polished arrangements. He grew his hair long, donned jeans, and embraced a stripped-down, raw sound that merged country, rock, and folk. Out of this rebellion came the outlaw movement, which included Waylon, Jennings, Chris Christopherson, and others who shared his disdain for Nashville's control. Ironically, once Nelson broke away from the establishment, his career exploded. Albums like Red-Headed Stranger and events like the Willie Nelson 4th of July picnic proved that audiences craved authenticity more than polish. The feud that once kept him down became the very fire that fueled his rise. In hindsight, Willie's battle with Nashville wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. He represented every artist who had ever felt suffocated by the system, every voice that didn't fit the template. His feud was less about clashing with one man and more about defying an entire machine. And in winning that battle, he didn't just carve his own path, he changed country music forever. Waylon Jennings versus Chet Atkins. If Willie Nelson fought the Nashville establishment by walking away, Waylon Jennings went to war with it head-on, and his primary adversary was none other than Chet Atkins, the architect of the polished Nashville sound. Their clash was less about personal dislike and more about two completely different visions of what country music should be. By the mid-1960s, Chet Atkins was a kingmaker in Nashville. As a producer and guitarist, he pioneered the country-politan style, smooth vocals, lush string arrangements, and crossover appeal to pop audiences. To executives, this was the future of country music. To Waylon Jennings, it was suffocating. Jennings, with his gruff voice, restless energy, and roots in rockabilly, hated being forced into slick productions that stripped away his edge. Waylon's early years with RCA, under Atkins' oversight, were a constant tug-of-war. Atkins insisted on polished studio musicians, predictable arrangements, and radio-friendly gloss. Jennings wanted freedom, to use his own band, record his songs his way, and capture the raw electricity of his live shows. The two often butted heads in the studio, with Atkins prioritizing control and efficiency, while Jennings seethed at what he felt was artistic imprisonment. The breaking point came in the early 1970s, when Jennings demanded complete creative control. He wanted out of the system that Atkins had built, even if it meant risking his career. Against the odds, RCA eventually relented, allowing Jennings to record on his own terms. The result? A string of groundbreaking albums, including Honky Tonk Heroes and Dreaming My Dreams, that defined the outlaw movement and solidified Waylon's place as a rebel icon. Atkins, for his part, never fully acknowledged the feud publicly. He respected Waylon's talent, but he also represented the very authority Jennings was determined to overthrow. To Waylon, Atkins embodied everything wrong with Nashville: control, polish, and conformity. To Atkins, Waylon was reckless, difficult, and unwilling to compromise. Their feud was less about words than about music itself, a creative and cultural tug-of-war that symbolized the split between Nashville's old guard and the outlaw generation. In retrospect, their clash was essential. Without Atkins' tight grip, there would have been nothing for Jennings to rebel against. And without Waylon's defiance, Nashville might never have been forced to recognize that audiences wanted something rawer, truer, and less manufactured. The Jennings-Atkins feud stands as one of the most defining creative battles of country's golden era, not a shouting match in the press, but a high-stakes fight over the very soul of country music. Conway Twitty versus Loretta Lynn behind the scenes. On stage, Conway Twitty and Loretta Lynn seemed like the perfect duo. Their chemistry was electric, their voices blended effortlessly, and together they delivered some of the most beloved duets in country music history. Songs like Louisiana Woman, Mississippi Man, and After the Fire Is Gone. Fans adored them, and their partnership became one of Nashville's most bankable acts of the 1970s. But behind the smiling faces and playful banter lay a quieter, more complicated rivalry. Loretta Lynn was already a star in her own right when she teamed up with Twitty. Known as the coal miner's daughter, she embodied authenticity and female strength in an industry dominated by men. Conway Twitty, meanwhile, was a crossover powerhouse, having transitioned from rockin' pavini roll to country with enormous success. Their pairing was a commercial goldmine, but it also raised an inevitable question: who was the real star? Behind the curtain, whispers spread about Conway's desire to command the spotlight. While Loretta's name carried prestige, some insiders suggested Conway bristled at always being introduced as her partner rather than celebrated individually. Conversely, Loretta was fiercely protective of her own image and worried that fans and promoters would see her as dependent on Twitty to stay relevant. The tension wasn't explosive, but it simmered in scheduling disputes, disagreements over creative choices, and subtle jockeying for credit. There were even reports of Conway pushing for more control over the material they recorded together. He wanted songs that played to his strengths as much as hers, while Loretta preferred duets that highlighted her storytelling and lyrical edge. Their producers often found themselves caught in the middle, trying to balance two enormous egos without breaking the formula that made them successful. Ironically, It was this very tension that gave their performances so much spark. The playful push and pull between them on stage wasn't just acting. It reflected the real tug-of-war behind the scenes. Fans interpreted it as chemistry, but insiders knew it was often rivalry disguised as charm. Over time, their duet partnership slowed, with each focusing more on solo projects. Publicly, they remained friendly, and Loretta even called Conway one of her dearest collaborators. But the reality is that their duo, like so many in Nashville, was as much about competition as it was about harmony. The Twitty-Lynn feud wasn't loud or scandalous, but it was real. Two stars fighting quietly for ownership of the spotlight while keeping up the illusion of perfect partnership. In the golden era of country, even the sweetest duets carried the sharp sting of rivalry. Faron Young versus Ralph Emery. Few feuds in Nashville were as colorful or as publicly messy as the clashes between Faron Young and legendary DJ Ralph Emery. Young, nicknamed the Hillbilly Heartthrob, was one of country's brightest stars during the 1950s and 60s, known for hits like Hello Walls. Emery, meanwhile, was the most powerful disc jockey in town, hosting WSM's Opry Star Spotlight and later Nashville Now, where his influence could make or break a record. Their relationship became a volatile mix of power, pride, and personality. At the heart of their feud was Faron Young's outspoken, sometimes reckless behavior. Known for his sharp tongue, heavy drinking, and penchant for controversy, Young often rubbed industry figures the wrong way. Emery, who prided himself on professionalism and control, became a frequent target of Faron's antics. Friends recalled incidents where Young would openly mock Emery on stage or in interviews, taking potshots at his radio persona and accusing him of favoring certain artists over others. The hostility wasn't one-sided. Emery, wielding immense power as a tastemaker, reportedly pushed back against Young's provocations by limiting his airplay or downplaying his new material. For an artist in a competitive industry, losing radio support was a serious blow, and Young often felt that Emery used his position to retaliate. What began as playful ribbing escalated into a battle of influence, Young's sharp wit versus Emery's microphone. One of the most infamous clashes came during a televised interview where Young, clearly emboldened by drink, went on a tirade against Emery. He accused the DJ of manipulating artists and playing favorites, comments that shocked the audience and embarrassed Emery. While some laughed off Young's behavior as part of his unpredictable personality, others saw it as career suicide. Nashville insiders whispered that Emery never forgot the insult, and his quiet influence contributed to Young's gradual slide from the spotlight. Despite their animosity, there was a strange bond between them. Young's needling of Emery became part of his legend, proof of his refusal to bow to industry politics, while Emery, for all his frustrations, often acknowledged Young's talent. But the feud also underscored a harsher truth. In Nashville's golden era, a performer's fate often rested in the hands of DJs and producers, and crossing them could mean professional ruin. Faron Young versus Ralph Emery wasn't about music so much as it was about power, ego, and the delicate balance between artist and gatekeeper. Their feud remains one of the most notorious in country history, a reminder that Nashville wasn't just about talent, it was about who controlled the microphone. The Carter family, June Carter versus Vivian Liberto, Johnny Cash's first wife. Among the most personal and painful feuds in country music's golden era was the silent war between June Carter and Vivian Liberto, the first wife of Johnny Cash. Unlike industry rivalries over charts and spotlight, this feud played out in the most intimate arena of all: marriage, love, and betrayal. Yet it spilled into Nashville gossip and shaped Cash's public image for decades. Vivian Liberto married Johnny Cash in 1954, long before he was the man in black. She stood by him through his early struggles, bore his children, and endured his grueling road schedule. But as Cash's fame skyrocketed in the 1960s, his marriage unraveled under the weight of addiction, infidelity, and absence. Enter June Carter, member of the legendary Carter family, who toured alongside Cash and became his confidant during his darkest battles with drugs and alcohol. What began as companionship grew into an undeniable romance. By the mid-1960s, whispers swirled around Nashville and beyond. Cash was drifting away from his wife and toward June. For Vivian, it was an open wound. She had endured his arrests, his binges, and the chaos of life as a superstar's wife, only to watch as he publicly paraded a new love by his side. June, meanwhile, was celebrated as the stabilizing force who saved Johnny Cash, a narrative that left Vivian painted as the forgotten woman in his story. The feud between June and Vivian was less about public spats. Neither woman aired their pain in Nashville's gossip rags, but about the perception of betrayal. Vivian saw herself erased from Cash's legacy, while June became enshrined as his partner and muse. Their children, caught in the middle, often bore the weight of divided loyalties. Behind closed doors, the bitterness was palpable, and even after Cash and Vivian divorced in 1966, the shadow of that rivalry lingered. Cash's eventual marriage to June Carter in 1968 cemented the narrative. June was hailed as the great love of his life, the woman who stood with him until his death. But Vivian's later memoir, I Walked the Line, revealed the other side, the heartbreak, the sense of betrayal, and the painful reality of being abandoned for another woman in the public eye. This feud wasn't about record sales or stage time. It was about love lost, trust broken, and reputations rewritten. The story of June Carter and Vivian Liberto reflects how even in country music's golden era, personal lives became public property, and the line between family and fame was often drawn in heartbreak.